Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Wednesday. It is the 22nd day of July, and it is in the year 2015, and it is a pleasure to be with you today. I really appreciate that. The weather has, a lot of the humidity has moved out. This may be the most comfortable day we've had here in Appalachia for several weeks, actually. We've had so much rain, and it looks like our forecast suggests that we're going to have 3 or 4 days in a row of this. Obviously a chance of a scattered shower here and there, but compared to what we've had, it's absolutely gorgeous. I got to tell you that as we broadcast today, I've got the windows open. I have on my home, I have what used to be a porch, and it's been enclosed. It gets very hot and it gets very cold in the wintertime because there's really no insulation in it. It's just a closed-in porch, and there's no insulation overhead because it's a flat roof. But on the other hand, I broadcast from here. And as I say, and sometimes in the summertime you cook, and in the wintertime you freeze. But it's other than that, it's okay. But anyway, I've got to say that there are 4 windows in this, two in the side and 1 at each end, and I got them all open. And the air flowing through here today is just absolutely delightful, and I love it. And at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, with these windows open, the whole neighborhood's gonna kind of hear the Virtual Center today. So I could open the second hour with a police car in front of the house, maybe, but I'm going to take a chance anyway because it's too nice a day. My neighbor next door has a dog that he keeps out and back, and frequently that dog will take to barking, and I usually close the windows so that the sound of the dog doesn't come across the air. But even the dog's gone today. My friend took him to work with him today, and so it looks to be even quiet over there. So all things suggest that barring an arrest in the middle of the program, I think we're pretty well covered today. Thank you so much for your willingness to tune in on this, our 3rd day of broadcasting this week, and we aim for every one of our weeks to be a full production week, but for various reasons, you remember last week on Tuesday, I was unable to get back because I ended up moving some furniture and I couldn't get back in time. But barring those kinds of things, I think we're doing pretty well. Again, I was just talking to Bob when we went on the air, before we got on the air, about the wonderful service that Horst has provided for us in Taiwan by putting all of our previous programs, all of our archived programs, on YouTube. I received a Facebook message from my sister-in-law today, and she basically put on her Facebook page instructions on how to access the archives through YouTube, and encouraged all of those who communicate frequently with her on Facebook, her friends, so to speak, to avail themselves of the archive. So I think that in spite of the fact that it baffled me and frustrated me for a while over the last couple of weeks getting into Facebook, I really do believe that it's increasing our audience somewhat and our visibility somewhat, and that's what we're all about. So anything we can do to achieve that, I think is a victory. So I want to thank Linda and of course my brother, her husband Paul, my brother, and for their support. My brother listens frequently, but I've always told him if he was doing this, I'd be listening to him too. So I think it's a kind of fair exchange. But I appreciate his willingness. He kind of gives me a rundown on the programs that he feels were successful and the ones that could have been done better, and I really appreciate that. I do invite you to participate actively in our program. We've pretty much finished. I just want to kind of make a few closing comments on the issue of the Greek credit crisis, the debt default situation that we've been dealing with for the last 3 or 4 programs, before moving on to something else, which I think is incredibly important as well. And I got to say that the material that we'll be dealing with today is going to be is a return to a program that we did several weeks ago, 5 or 6 weeks ago, on the attack on truth and the efforts to at disinformation in order to confuse the American public. We spent quite a bit of time on that, if you remember, some weeks ago. And as an example, we pulled a memo from the Tobacco Institute. From Brown and Williamson from the early 80s, which made the point that our product is doubt, and that basically their strategy for meeting the challenge of climate reform and regulation was essentially a campaign of disinformation and outright misinformation. To be so again, it's not only counter information, but absolutely some of the information that is put out contrary to it is just out and out false. I came across these documents about 10 days ago, a week ago, and we got into the Greek situation and the Greek debt situation, and I put them aside with the idea that we'd eventually get to them, and that's what we're going to do today. I got to tell you this because I even found myself chuckling to myself as I was putting material together for our program today. It's been a week to 10 days or so since I looked at this material. And, of course, in a week or 10 days, it becomes a little bit fuzzy. And when I went back through it today and was kind of putting it together for the program, I had forgotten some of the specific material that I have. And I got fired up all over again by it. But it's really interesting because even though I read this material 2 weeks ago, going back over it for today's program, I got angry again. The material is so powerful, I believe that it made me quite angry. And I hope that you will learn from the program and enjoy it as much as I've learned from it. I think this is information all of us need to have. I'm very, very grateful to the Union of Concerned Scientists and the others who, through lawsuits and Freedom of Information Act issues and subpoenas and all the rest of it, have been able to lay their hands on some of the documents for the material that we will be looking at today, because it is so important, and obviously it's not making an appearance anywhere else but here. But first, I want to give you kind of the specifics about the program and invite you to participate actively in it. First comes our phone number, which will get you directly on the air. So if you have comments or concerns or questions or observations or other commentary related to our program, I would love to hear from you, as I know our other listeners would as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676, and you might jot that down, especially if you think you might be inclined to give us a call sometime over the next couple of hours as we present material. If you are inclined, if you are moved, I've been watching the advertisements on television, especially on ESPN, for the recent ESPY ceremonies that were held this past weekend. And I've been listening to the commercial of Jimmy Valvano. You remember the coach for North Carolina State, who passed away with cancer some years ago, and he's been a big driver of this campaign to raise money for cancer research. And so, as a lead up to the ESPYs this past weekend, there's been an awful lot of advertising, and Jimmy Valvano in that last speech he gave before he passed away, the very famous one, talked about the fact that we all want to have 3 emotions every single day: One of them is to laugh. The second one is to think. And the third one is to have your emotions move to the point of tears. And as he says in the advertisement, laughing, thinking, crying, all in one day is a pretty good day. And I guess what I'm saying is, as I read some of the material that we'll be addressing today, I was moved, not to tears, but to anger and frustration in many ways. So I think it's that kind of material. It makes me extremely angry, and because I find it insulting, and that's one of the points that I really want to make as a prelude to this. Today's program. But again, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number, again, area code 304-663-4676. If you would like to communicate directly with me via email, then I would enjoy hearing from you that way. And especially if you are a little bit reluctant to get on the air, believe me, I understand that. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your ideas. And again, I kind of reserve the right, if you do send me an email and there's material in it that I think would help our other listeners, I feel that I have your permission to take the substance of your comments and share them with our other listeners. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, at gmail.com. And then again, over the last couple of weeks, we do have access through our new Facebook page, which is entitled the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. If you just type in the Virtual Center, I think you'll gain access to us on Facebook. And as I mentioned, I'm taking the opportunity to post some materials that I have, some commentary that I've written. I mean, I'm not calling it a blog because I don't do it every day. I think I'd like to. I think eventually, if I could get to the point that I can kind of pull together the discipline that would be necessary to do this. I have a good friend, a lifelong friend, 50 years we've been friends, who does this. He's a dean at the University of St. Louis, University of Missouri at St. Louis. And he's been doing a daily, writing a daily piece on the internet for a couple of years now on prominent people, or people that really may not be that prominent, whose birthday it is. He's using the dates every single day. He comes up with a story about somebody. It's one of those things that it's not long and it's newsy, and I just marvel at the discipline that he has, because this thing is available at the latest by 8 a.m. every single morning, including weekends, holidays, and everything else. And when he travels, he takes his laptop with him, and he writes, and does the research, and writes every single day. And I marvel at that kind of discipline, and I'm a little bit reluctant to take on that, the idea of a daily blog, because I'd find myself missing it for one reason or other, I'm sure. But at the same time, I have written quite a bit over the months and over the years, especially since we've been doing the Virtual Center. I have a number of position papers on a number of issues, many of them obviously related to the Virtual Center, and therefore focusing to a large degree on the founders, and probably James Madison and Jefferson are the key ones. As well as some of the Federalist Papers, and of course Hamilton is the author of many of those. And I'd like to be able to take advantage of the Facebook page to be able to post a lot of these things, and that gives all of us, all of you, an opportunity to offer a comment or a suggestion. But the point is that they are there, and if you find one that you particularly like and you feel that it would be worth keeping, then by all means, feel free to copy and paste it and keep it in your own files for your own future reference. I not only invite you to do that, but I obviously appreciate the fact that if you find a particular thing that I've written worth keeping, then that makes it entirely worthwhile, and I want to thank you for it. So again, our Facebook page is just type in on Facebook the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. And I remind you again that our friend Horst has made all of our previous programs here at the Virtual Center available on YouTube. All you need to do is go to youtube.com. In the search space that it gives you there, just type in Dr. Bill O'Brien, and you will see there all of our previous programs by date. I got a wonderful email from not an email actually, it was a Facebook comment from one of our listeners who's apparently been a listener for some time of the Head On Radio Network, and it was a very complimentary email, and but he made the point that on days when, for one reason or another, we're unable to broadcast, he's gone to the YouTube offerings and he's randomly, by date, just randomly picked a program. And he said he's done that a number of times, and he hasn't been disappointed, which is one of the nicest things anybody's ever said to me. So I appreciate that as well. Anyway, welcome to our program on this Wednesday, the 22nd day of July. And again, please feel free to call if you are moved to make a comment or to offer a comment or a suggestion or raise a question or whatever. I'm sure our other listeners would appreciate it as well. That's the reason we have the phone number, and we would love to hear from you. As I mentioned, I'd like to begin today's program with just a closing comment or two on the Greek situation, and specifically on a couple of the resources that we looked at yesterday, because some of the commentary that I've received, emails and on Facebook, relates to the information in this commentary. This is not my information. In fact, yesterday's program featured, as much as anything else, materials that were included in a piece written by Robert Reich, former Labor Secretary in the Clinton administration, and basically he dealt with the role of Wall Street banks, specifically Goldman Sachs, in negotiating some of the loans to, as the examples we used yesterday, the city of Detroit, the Detroit Water Company, Chicago's public school system, trying to work out a deal with the city of Oakland. And again, my point is to emphasize the way it works. And again, I think the way that this issue of finance works helps us really understand a little bit better the situation that Greece has found itself in. Basically, the citizens of Greece have found themselves locked into a debt situation which clearly their economy is not capable of pulling them out of. They have successfully negotiated what I believe is the third bailout, if you will, over the last 10 or 12 years. But again, some of the terms of the deals that have been extended to them by Goldman Sachs, which is the one we used yesterday, the example that we used yesterday from Robert Reich's research, it seems to me suggests that if anything goes awry in the economy in any way, any kind of deflation or any kind of recession or economic slowdown anywhere in the world, for example, that impacts negatively on your economy, then you're going to fall behind on these debt obligations. And it's very clear in some of the behavior we've seen from some of these firms like Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan being the two examples that we used yesterday, that these companies aren't really that willing to renegotiate or restructure loans. I think we saw that with the housing situation here in the country, in our country, after the recession of 07 and 08, when the housing bubble burst, and many of these banks got into trouble. And President Bush, before he left office, set up the TARP program to bail out some of these banks. And when President Obama came in, he followed up and supported that particular initiative, and basically, as you know, followed it up with his own stimulus package, which economists have debated, since then, whether in fact it was too much or whether in fact it was not quite enough. Obviously, our economy has recovered quite a bit, but we focused more and more in previous months about the fact that only certain people, the so-called 1%, seem to be benefiting from the recovery from the recession. An awful lot of Americans were immeasurably hurt during those recessions, whether it was their retirement money, whether it was loss of their homes, whether it was loss of jobs, whatever it might be. It's clear that many of our citizens have not recovered. The economy may have recovered in terms of the number in the Dow Jones average, which continues to hover around 18,000. The fact of the matter is that the people that are reaping the most benefits from the Dow and from the stock market obviously are the major investors, the hedge funders, the arbitrage folks, and all the rest of it, who play and gamble heavily, many of them with our money, with our retirement funds, with funds from our state legislatures, with funds from our cities and communities. Basically, what has happened is that many of our state governments, many of our municipalities have been lured into taking pension money and all the rest of it and investing in the market. And what we have done is turn our money over to people who continue to play with it. And what we learned in 07 and 08 is that if they lose and if the market tanks, we have defined many of these operations, many of these organizations as too big to fail. And so I think one of the people that made a comment on Facebook mentioned this about yesterday's program, and it really hit me, because I think the person who said it is exactly right. And that is, many of these companies like J.P. Morgan and like Goldman Sachs, who benefited from the bailout, from the use of public tax money to bail them out of the recession, and were eventually able to recover to the point that they were able to pay back these loans. Car companies, GM, for example, Chrysler some years ago. While these companies were more than willing to avail themselves of aid and assistance from the taxpayer to help them out of debt situations, it appears, as we look at the situation in Greece, that these companies are not nearly as inclined to help out others as they were when when they needed the help. In other words, they were more than willing to benefit from a helping hand when the situation called for it. They aren't all that willing to extend a helping hand to others who find themselves in a similar situation. I think that's a little bit hypocritical, and I think the person who made that point on Facebook is onto something. The other thing that I want to emphasize, because before we leave the topic entirely, is the issue of the locus of power and the realities as to who controls that power. It seems to me there are two issues, but they are interrelated. Where you put power pretty much determines who will wield that power. Somebody's going to have power. Somebody's making decisions. And the question is, when you start to make structural determinations as to where you want to put the locus of power, you are in effect affecting who will be able to exercise that power once the final decision is made. For example, in the United States in the 1780s, when the controversy between the Articles of Confederation and the new Constitution was being debated in the late 80s, in the late 1780s, the issue was one of moving decision-making from the state level to the national level. And of course we know that Madison and Hamilton and some of the other so-called Federalist leaders of the time were very, very adamant in their support for the Constitution of the United States. It's important to recognize that in advocating the Constitution, they were consciously, not unconsciously, but consciously supporting a move or supporting a document, the Constitution of the United States, which would effectively deny to the majority of the people in states an ability to affect their own governments in terms of support and assistance. So long as power was on the state level, it was possible to organize majorities, Madison called them the majority faction, and put enough pressure on your state legislatures to force the kind of legislation that the majority of people believed they needed, which increasingly in the mid and late 1780s was financial assistance, was debt and tax relief. And so through the printing of installment laws and stay laws and paper money laws and all the rest of it, legislatures were able to come to the relief of their own citizens. Once the Constitution of the United States was ratified, that majority became ineffective. Because since the power was moved from the state level to the national level, organizing the majority of the people in a particular state was meaningless. One of the things we're seeing during the efforts to call a second convention in this country is an effort to make the kinds of amendments in our Constitution that would return much of that power back to the state level. But it's important to realize who's promoting this change. With power coming back to the state level, if the amendment procedure or strategy were to be successful, many of the amendments that are being proposed by the right would return power to the states. But it's very important to recognize what that means in terms of who would wield that power. It's those forces, those interests that have been able to garner control over the state's political apparatus. The big money that's being pumped into our campaign system, into our election system, has allowed a whole slew of so-called novices, new people to the field of politics, first-timers, if you will, to be elected to state legislatures. They are heavily funded by organizations like Koch Industries and some of our major corporations. They really don't have a political track record on which opponents can run against them because they have never done anything. Many of them are political novices. Many of them have turned out to be absurd representatives. You know, the Aikens, the Claude Aikens, and some of these people that have some of these Tea Partiers that have surfaced over the last couple of years, that have come up with some outlandish things. And of course, what they're doing is they're revealing not only a little bit about themselves, but their lack of experience and lack of ability, lack of competence. The one thing they do have, however, is unfailing loyalty to those who gave them the money to get elected. And as part of that is the implicit contract that if they don't vote according to the way they are told to vote, then they will not be reelected, because their backers can easily take the funding and find another candidate to lavish it upon. So their continued political career is totally dependent on the people that paid for and bought their election. In reality, these are the people who control the states. It stands to reason that they would be supporting the kind of amendments that would return power to the states. That's what we need to be careful of. This is an effort to effectively undo the political realities of the Constitution of the United States. And I think we need to appreciate that. Before we left the Greek situation, I wanted to make that point. because that's what we're about here at the Virtual Center. The study of the Constitution and the impacts of the Constitution and what not only it meant then, but what it continues to mean now. The same debate, the same situation is really being fought out in Europe over the struggles surrounding the Greek default situation. Because while 61% of the Greek people in a referendum several weeks ago encouraged their government to vote no on the terms of the bailout being offered them by their creditors, the fact of the matter is, if more and more power is centralized under the European Union, then we will have seen the last of 61% referendums meaning anything, if that makes sense. So I think it's important to know that. So I think the more we can understand the political situation that we lived through here in America in the 1780s, the better able we are to understand some of the ramifications of what's going on in Europe. If you've been reading so much of the information that's come out on the Greek situation, the Greek debt situation, I would suggest that if you can transfer that knowledge or that of what you learned from that situation back to the 18th century, I think it'll help us really clarify and make sense out of a lot of things that we probably didn't get when we studied it in school. So I think it's an educational experience, and that's really kind of what we're all about here at the Virtual Center. So with that, I'd like to move into I was going to say a totally new subject, but it's not totally new because we dealt with this subject, this issue of climate change and the issue of disinformation and misinformation. Some weeks ago, we focused specifically on the tobacco industry and the extent to which the tobacco industry was able to fund a campaign of disinformation and misinformation which held federal government regulation of tobacco products at arm's length for years, from the early 80s well up into the beginning of the 21st century, before we began to see warnings on cigarette packs and all the rest of it. One thing I want to mention about that particular issue that I would remind folks is that while we get these warnings, while the campaign to regulate, control, and limit the sale of tobacco products has been somewhat successful in this country, although it took years and years and years to pull it off, the fact of the matter is similar warnings are not going to those in other countries. In other words, the very same tobacco companies that have caved in to federal regulation in this country face no such government regulation on the international market. So consequently, a pack of cigarettes that you buy in this country will have the warning on it about hazardous to your health. But a package of cigarettes that's being sold overseas, even though it was made in this country, does not contain that warning. I think that says a lot about what we're dealing with here. It says a lot about free enterprise. It says a lot about the needs of corporations. And it says an awful lot about the sincerity and the ethics, the morals associated with these kinds of issues. Companies have found a way to remain comfortable by walking a fine line between what's right on the one hand and what they need financially to survive on the other. And for more often than not, they've been able to get our government to go along with that. So I think that's important to recognize. I think it kind of speaks to how significant corporate funding and corporations and the whole issue of economic growth is to our very way of life, how much political and social as well as economic influence these organizations and these operations have been able to garner over the years, and how much our way of life has become dependent upon them to the point that any kind of proposed change which is going to affect their bottom line They feel very comfortable whether in fact it's right, whether they agree personally, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. They seem to be able to find a way to walk both sides of the fence at the same time. I wonder how sometimes it's possible to do that, but there are an awful lot of people doing it. And I think that's what we're going to be dealing with. Earlier this month, earlier in July, around, first week of July, so to speak, documents appeared on the internet thanks to suits launched by Greenpeace and some other climate organizations, environmental organizations. I think my dog is back next door, so I'm going to close the windows. These documents were released through actions created by some of these environmental groups, as well as legal action underwritten by the Union of Concerned Scientists, who were reacting to the campaign of misinformation and disinformation that the fossil fuel industry seemed to be engaged in to counter what hard science was telling us about climate change and about the environment. If you have become as aware as I think I have, as all of us have, as we look at the news each evening, the evening news, we're seeing some weather extremes in this country and around the world that are causing a lot of people to shake their heads and wonder. We've seen, just as examples, we've seen California going through one of the worst droughts in its history. We've seen evidence of melting of the ice caps to the point that the sea levels around the world are rising. Hard science has told us for years that human activity is to a large degree, if not mostly, responsible for these kinds of climate changes. Obviously, a major culprit in all of this are those industries that burn fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, whatever, that ultimately man himself, according to science, seems to be largely responsible for what's happening to our climate, to our environment, with dire warnings that if we don't find a way to change things, if we don't find a way to minimize and cut back on our burning of fossil fuels, if we continue to pollute the environment and heat up the atmosphere, we're going to be suffering severe climate disaster in a number of ways. And in recent years, we've seen it. We've seen hurricanes that are producing stronger winds and more total rainfall than we've ever witnessed before. We're seeing snowstorms in the wintertime that are dropping more snow than ever before. Place after place around the nation and around the world seems to be setting records in snowfall or rainfall or drought. It's not just melting. It's extremes in climate change. The droughts are drier. The wet seasons are wetter. My wife was just telling me a couple of days ago about the fact that they have had snow in Hawaii at the same time that we're seeing upper 60s and lower 70-degree temperatures in Alaska. The climate, the environment is undergoing severe change. And science has been telling us for some time that man's way of life, man's behavior, is in large part responsible for this. It stands to reason that the nations that are the most developed are the ones doing the most damage. Those parts of the world, primarily in the southern hemisphere, that have not experienced economic growth and development are not burning fossil fuels to the degree that developed countries in the northern hemisphere are burning. Obviously, those countries are not doing the damage to the environment that we're doing. But as the Pope's encyclical made clear, these poorer areas of the world are the ones that are going to suffer the most and suffer first for the results. In other words, the people who cause it are not the people who are going to feel the pain of it, at least initially, although eventually we all will. There was a report the other night that I saw on television that pointed out the potential for sea levels rising, that if the sea level rose by 10 inches, I think it was, it would obliterate cities. The city of Seattle, the coastline in Florida. Many of the areas, many of the beachfront areas that have been lucrative real estate booms in our economy for so long, suddenly will become vulnerable to floods and disasters. This is extremely serious. Obviously, it's hard to nail down exactly what the impacts are going to be or where they're going to show. Last night, for example, there was a report that it appears that the formation of what the climate folks are calling an El Nino in the Pacific is liable to bring the kinds of heavy rain to California which will relieve the drought. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that the weather folks are now becoming a little bit concerned because the El Nino that seems to be forming around the equator in the Pacific seems to show the potential of being the largest El Nino ever, which means the severity of the rains that it produces are going to be the heaviest ever, which means that California could find itself moving from severe drought into the kind of flooding that no peoples, no region could possibly withstand. So I think we're all kind of on pins and needles and we're all nervous. What we do know, if we accept the realities of what hard science is telling us, is that things are changing and they're changing dramatically. And the second thing is that human behavior is to a large degree responsible for it. The fact of the matter is there are a number of industries that have earned their fortunes, if you will, in the burning of fossil fuels, the oil companies, the coal companies, the ConocoPhillipses, the Occidental Petroleums, the Exxon Mobils, the BPs, the Shells. These companies would be devastated if suddenly we shift away from the burning of fossil fuels. And so for a long time, and when I say this, I mean over the last 25 to 30 years, we have all seen a campaign aimed at dismissing or belittling the potential of wind energy and solar energy as an alternative to the burning of fossil fuels. In fact, we have seen the fossil fuel industry move quickly into the natural gas industry at the expense of coal, because it appears that natural gas, the burning of natural gas, cuts carbon dioxide emissions by close to half over coal. So therefore, industries throughout the developed world seem to be moving further and further away from coal and moving more and more toward gas. But science is also telling us that there are serious dangers to the burning of gas. Carbon monoxide, which is potentially in the long term even more devastating to the environment, is released by the burning of natural gas. So it seems like the solution that natural gas seem to be providing for us is not nearly the solution that we need. The Pope's encyclical was released into this controversy because the Pope's major premise was that we have got to basically make the kinds of cultural and economic mega changes that change our entire way of life if we are going to reverse some of the damage that we've already done to the planet. The reaction, the negative reaction to the Pope's encyclical, speaks to how volatile those who earn their living, their way of life through the burning of fossil fuels, how unwilling they're going to be, how determined they are to dig in their heels and hang on and fight back. I guess the bottom line here is, if the scientists are correct, and I think we have to assume that while hard science is not necessarily exact science, there's enough evidence to indicate that there's enough validity, supportable evidence to indicate that the basic premise of human responsibility for what's happening to our planet has become impossible to deny. Yet many are in the business of continuing to deny it. Early in July, 180 internal documents that were uncovered through the Freedom of Information Act and other mechanisms. The Union of Concerned Scientists released the entire trove of documents on the internet. The most poignant ones, I believe they're the most poignant ones, are listed if you go online as under the heading of deception dossiers, climate deception dossiers, pieces of evidence, emails, formal documents and agreements, action plans, secret meetings where strategies were planned and designed to counter hard science by launching a highly funded, a very well-funded counter-campaign to the scientists. The model for the entire campaign is the model used by the tobacco industry in the 80s and 90s. A concerted effort to sow confusion and doubt in the minds of the American people to the point that people would become so confused that they wouldn't know what to believe. The result would be then that government and government action to do something about the damage to the environment would be blocked, would be stopped dead in its tracks. The situation became dire for the fossil fuel industry in the late 1990s. In 1997, the Clinton administration bought into the Kyoto Protocols. You'll remember that the Kyoto Conference on Climate adopted a number of agreements on an international level that nations would agree to, targets for reducing carbon emissions. And in 1997, the Clinton administration agreed to the Kyoto Protocol and brought that agreement back to the United States with the idea that in order to become operative, it would have to make its way through the Senate of the United States. That fact launched one of the most well-funded, secretive, deceptive, unethical, immoral campaigns of public misinformation and disinformation that the nation had ever seen. It's very, very similar to what the tobacco industry conducted in the 80s and early 90s. But it's so much closer to where we are now. It's funded by some of the largest perpetrators in the fossil fuel industry, the oil companies, the American Petroleum Institute, which is made up of fossil fuel industries like Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, Occidental, ConocoPhillips, Peabody Coal, Peabody Industries, one of the largest and most influential coal companies ever. It's ironic, it just so happens that the former president, who I believe passed away a few years ago, of Peabody, was a West Virginian. His name was Lilly, as I think half of the people in West Virginia are named Lilly. But Mr. Lilly was president of Peabody. And some years ago here in Beckley at our Rotary Club, he flew in to make a presentation to our Rotary Club. This was in the 90s. The point is that these organizations sprang into action in response to Kyoto and in response to the support that it received from the Clinton administration. Many of the documents that were released earlier this month under the Freedom of Information Act are documents related to that campaign, to that industry campaign to counter Kyoto and to undertake a massive, multifaceted campaign to confuse, belittle, challenge, misinform the American people in order to make sure that the support for Kyoto necessary in the United States Senate never happened. In 2002, the Bush administration was able to orchestrate the rejection of Kyoto. At that point, a number of the organizations and committees created to conduct this campaign disbanded. That doesn't mean that the campaign stopped. It just means that the thrust of the campaign on the part of many people stopped, because a number of these organizations were able to claim victory when the Bush administration reversed what the Clinton administration had done on climate, on Kyoto. It is unbelievable what we see in a number of these documents. I want to take time in our second hour today to share some of this content with you. More specifically, there are a number of dossiers, 7 of them, that appear in this package of released documents. Let me share with you what some of these dossiers address. One of them is an industry primer that was developed in 1995. The title of the primer is Predicting Future Climate Change, a primer written in 1995 by a fossil fuel company scientist. The dossier, the primer itself, came to light in 2009 when it was released to the New York Times. It was written by a team of researchers led by Leonard Bernstein, not Leonard Bernstein of the Boston Pops and the New York Philharmonic. Leonard Bernstein happened to go to the same high school I did, so I know a little about him. This Leonard Bernstein is a chemical engineer and climate expert who worked with Mobil Corporation on behalf of an industry group entitled or called the Global Climate Coalition. It authored the 1995 primer on predicting climate change. That's one of the documents I would like to share with you. That's Deception Dossier number 7. Deception Dossier number 6 deals with the American Legislative Exchange Council. That's the organization we dealt with in some depth when we were looking at the move toward a second constitutional convention, and the role that the American Legislative Exchange Council was playing in that effort. As we know, the Legislative Exchange Council received substantial funding from Koch Industries, which, by the way, is a fossil fuel industry, as well as ExxonMobil. Deception Dossier number 5 is one that I was particularly interested in because it focuses on coal. It focuses on activities undertaken by the coal industry in the early 90s. More specifically, the creation by coal of an Information Council on the Environment. Acronym ICE, ICE, Information Council on the Environment. It's an organization, a coal-driven organization, that was launched in 1991. It's an organization that disbanded that very same year, 1991, when its behavior, its activities, and its strategies were leaked to the press, and the general public became aware of what the coal industry was involved in. At that point, the leaders of the movement scattered and ran for cover. So the documents associated with that particular part of the initiative, the fossil fuel initiative, all happened within the year 1991. But many of the documents themselves didn't surface until now. They are unbelievable. I live in southern West Virginia. I've seen the campaign conducted by the coal industry to counter efforts by the Environmental Protection Agency and other federal organizations to limit pollution of the air and limit pollution of the water and all the rest of it. Efforts to find ways to stop the blowing up of mountains and mountaintop removal. All of this. I've seen it. I'm here and I'm looking at it all. I've seen one of the most successful publicity PR campaigns that could ever imagine happen right before my eyes in an organization in this region of southern West Virginia, which is coal country, called the Friends of Coal. It's one of the most successful PR campaigns I've ever seen or read about. Many people that I know are supporters of this group. Many businesses in my community have signs in the window making it clear that they are Friends of Coal. Because what this organization and others have been able to do is shift the blame for what's happening to the coal industry and the loss of jobs in the coal industry to the Obama administration, to Obama's so-called war on coal. When the fact of the matter is the coal jobs were disappearing well before Obama was a name that anybody even knew about. But to people losing their jobs, people who feel threatened, feel their whole way of life being threatened, they can't be bothered, it seems, with the details. The fact of the matter is the Obama administration is conducting a war to destroy the coal industry. And that in itself is enough to respond. And we have seen some of the biggest public functions, car shows, public entertainment in July. We have every July for the last several years, we've had this activity here in the very region I live in around Beckley, West Virginia, with classic car show and big name entertainment from the world of country music. And I mean big. The biggest names in country music have been here. They have been at the Greenbrier for the Greenbrier Golf Classic, which just happened the week of July 4th. All of these things receive substantial support by Friends of Coal. There's a women's affiliate of the Friends of Coal. I know several of the members of that group. The fact of the matter is, even though the coal industry's Information Council on the Environment was born and died within the same year of 1991, the publicity campaign that brought them into existence did not stop. It continues. While countries all around the world are shifting from coal to natural gas, the same thing is happening here in West Virginia, but only grudgingly. Instead of getting out in front of a movement that everyone could see if they but looked, and moving towards diversification of an economy, which the coal industry itself had prevented from diversifying for so long, the industry has dug in its heels and conducted a counter-campaign which has caused West Virginia to split right down the middle over the issue of coal versus natural gas, over the issue of the Environmental Protection Agency and its efforts to create or to produce clean air and clean water. Suddenly, this is all part of a campaign to destroy our way of life. The similarities between this and the pre-Civil War South and the attack on slavery are so strong and so obvious that it's hard not to notice that similarity. I want to take our second hour today and share some of these documents with you. If we don't finish today, we'll pick it up when we get back together again next Monday. But a lot of this is just sharing information with you. I invite you to go online and look at the industry, the climate deception dossier, and you will see there 6 or 7 of the major documents that I'm referring to, plus other pieces of information. The extent to which the industry, the fossil fuel industry, funded contrarian science, issued grants, one of the biggest ones through the Smithsonian Institute, to fund a particular scientist who set out to prove that changes in solar energy were principally responsible for climate change, not human behavior. For years, a company based in Birmingham, Alabama, called Southern Company Services Incorporated, which comprised a number of fossil fuel companies and utility companies, funded this research through the Smithsonian in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which set out to disprove what hard science was telling us about human behavior and climate, by coming up with a whole raft of scientific findings related to solar energy and what changes in solar energy in the universe were principally responsible for what was happening to our climate. This is the kind of stuff that comprised the industry's response to science. It's unbelievable. It's 7 minutes after the hour. In the East, 7 minutes after 2 p.m. I'd like to pause and take a 4 or 5 minute break, and then come back and take our last 45 or 50 minutes together and share with you some particulars on this campaign. I think it's amazing. But first, let's pause for a break. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to thank you on this Wednesday for tuning in. I invite you to stay with us after a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and thank you for that absolutely wonderful music. It was just great. Thank you. Upbeat.
You're more than welcome.
Great. I have in my hands, as a result of these released documents, material from a program launched in April of 1998 by the American Petroleum Institute in order to counter the Clinton administration's decision in December 1997 to agree in Kyoto, Japan, to a treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to reduce the changes happening to the climate. The American Petroleum Institute and its member companies launched a major campaign, a multifaceted campaign. And as an introduction to this industry initiative, the industry put out a draft copy of a document called the Global Climate Science Communications Plan, Global Climate Science Communications Plan. And in a memo to the industry, written by Joe Walker for the science team that developed this plan, industrial representatives were invited to respond at the next meeting of the industry. They were invited to bring comments on this particular strategy, on this particular plan, to the next meeting for upgrades. The introduction to the action plan recounted the history beginning in December of '97, when the Clinton administration agreed to the treaty produced in Kyoto, Japan in late 1997. Let me read you a couple of what I think are choice sentences and issues from this action plan. The report goes as follows. The climate change theory being advanced by the treaty supporters is based primarily on forecasting models with a very high degree of uncertainty. In fact, it is not known for sure whether A, climate change actually is occurring, or B, if it is, whether humans really have any influence on it. That's the industry's response. But also as part of the industry's response is the recognition that environmentalist groups around the world were acting and celebrating as if they had won a tremendous victory at the Kyoto conference in December of '97. As an example, there's a quotation included in this action plan written by Tom Wathen, who's Executive Vice President of the National Environmental Trust, who wrote the following about the successes that environmentalists were claiming from Kyoto. As important as the extent of the coverage was, the tone and tenor of it, as important as the extent of the coverage was the tone and tenor of it. In a change from just 6 months ago, most media stories no longer presented global warming as just a theory over which reasonable scientists could differ. Most stories describe predictions of global warming as the position of the overwhelming number of mainstream scientists. That the environmental community had, to a great extent, settled the scientific issue with the U.S. media is the other great success that began perhaps several months earlier but became apparent during Kyoto. In other words, the environmental groups were crowing about the results of Kyoto, and it was eating the industry raw. This action plan goes on. Because the science underpinning the global climate change theory has not been challenged effectively in the media or through other vehicles reaching the American public, there is widespread ignorance which works in favor of the Kyoto Treaty and against the best interests of the United States. Indeed, the public has been highly receptive to the Clinton administration's plans. There's been little, if any, public resistance or pressure applied to Congress to reject the treaty, except by those inside the Beltway with vested interests. This entire action plan was designed to remedy that lack of resistance. The report goes on. Charlton Research's survey of 1,100 informed Americans suggests that while Americans currently perceive climate change to be a great threat, public opinion is open enough to change on climate science. when informed that some scientists believe that there's not enough evidence to suggest that what is called global climate change is a long-term change due to human behavior and human activities. 58% of those surveyed said that they were more likely to oppose the Kyoto Treaty. Moreover, half the respondents harbored doubts about climate science. So in a sense, what really is happening here is that this action plan is pulling together the result of a survey issued to 1,100, quote, informed Americans, unquote, which indicates that the public's overall support for climate change and for the Kyoto Agreement to stop it is support that the survey indicates is rather soft. There's opportunity here for the industry to counter Kyoto. Consequently, the following action plan has been developed. The goal of the project: a majority of the American people, including industry leadership, recognizes that significant uncertainties exist in climate science, and therefore raises questions among those, Congress, who chart the future U.S. course on global climate change. In other words, the support for Kyoto is soft. There's opportunity here. This action plan was developed to take advantage of that opportunity. How will we know if we've won? How will we know that we've been successful? According to this action plan, quote, victory will be achieved when the following is achieved. Number one, average citizens understand, recognize, uncertainties in climate science. Recognition of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. So the first indicator or measure of success for this campaign is when it is shown that average citizens recognize uncertainties about science, climate science, and that the conventional wisdom is, among the general public, we just don't know. When we reach that point of confusion and doubt, we're winning. That's the first part of victory being achieved. The second measure, media understands or recognizes uncertainties in climate science. In other words, we'll know we're winning not only when the conventional wisdom in the general public is confused, but when the media acknowledge that it too is confused. When we reach the point where we've confused them, we'll know we're winning. Number three, media coverage reflects balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current conventional wisdom. When we begin to see evidence that the general public and the media both are beginning to say there are two positions on this and both of them are legitimate, we just don't know which one to go for, then we'll know we're winning. Number four, we'll know we're winning when industry senior leadership understands uncertainties in climate science, making them stronger ambassadors to those who shape climate policy. We'll know we have a chance of winning when you, those in the industry, senior management, begin to take the public pulpit and argue against science. When we reach the point where you begin to act, we'll know we're on the right track. And finally, number 5, we'll know we're winning when those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant science appears to be out of touch with reality. When we can convince the general public and the media that the major supporters of the Kyoto Treaty are out of touch with reality, we'll know we're getting somewhere. When we can take the environmentalists, and this is me talking, not the report, when we'll know we're winning, when we can convince the general public and the media that the biggest environmentalists, the biggest supporters of environmental reform and getting a handle and controlling climate change, when we can convince the general public that these people are tree huggers and are enemies to our way of life here in America, we'll know we're winning.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob.
I thought I would let you know, and I thought you would enjoy knowing, that we have Horst on the line who would like to engage in the conversation.
That'd be great. That would be great.
Go right ahead, Horst.
Bob, thank you very much, Bob. Horst, how are you?
Hey, Dr. Bill. All right.
Okay. I'm doing great, thank you. I was just beginning to roll a little bit, and that's great. No, you didn't interrupt at all. You kind of brought me back to reality because I was kind of getting into myself a little bit here. Anyway, how are you?
Oh, doing well. I'm doing all right.
I really want to thank you for the YouTube stuff. That is just fabulous.
Oh no, what I was trying to do over at the Virtual Center page, I don't know why it is. I was trying to put like an actual link to the video itself that people could just like hit the play button and let it go, and it didn't work for some reason. So that's why I put in that extended explanation about, oh boy, this didn't work. I don't know what's going on. So whatever.
Right. Well, it was interesting.
But head on.
My sister-in-law, as I mentioned at the beginning today, my sister-in-law on her Facebook page printed instructions about, they got into it last night, and they were looking at it, and they were talking about how fabulous it is. And she put this morning, said, it's so simple to get into. Just do this and do that. Just go to YouTube, go to the search place, type in O'Brien's name, and all the programs will come up, every single one of them. It's just great. So
yeah, I think there's a way to make it happen, but it's not as intuitive as it ought to be. But
yeah, I understand. Hey, it's technology. What can you do? So you've been
to fix it.
I've got to ask you, how is your situation with the job coming?
It's okay.
Last time I talked to you, you were kind of on the verge of a change. You had said that you were pretty well, putting in endless days and stuff, but some of this was looking like it might begin to change or let up a little bit or something.
Yeah, well, the long and the short of it is I've essentially cut my schedule from a 72-hour a week down to about 48. So,
oh my God, that's great.
Yeah, well, it is
48 hours. Jeb Bush will love you.
Oh yeah, well, I'm uniquely American, except I do it all at one job, and I'm not in America. So
yeah, right. I mean, yeah, and you don't even have to take time to travel from one job to the other. It's all in the same place.
No, yeah. That's not all on the clock, obviously. It's a bit less than that, but that's basically what it comes out to in terms of like time spent. But
right.
But it's all right. I've actually been on this new schedule for a couple of weeks now, but I'm still in the stage of kind of decompressing.
Well, I tell you,
I haven't learned how to get productive in other phases of my life yet, but I did actually.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I did get the YouTube channel caught up. I kind of let that go slack for quite a bit longer than I thought I did. I thought there was a period of time there where Bob was kind of away, and then you were away, and then there were not that many programs. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to kind of go slack too, and then
take a break.
Next time I knew, like 6 weeks had gone by, I'm like, oh, geez, That's
I know. Those kinds of things get ahead of you. I know. Yeah. So anyway, what you got? Do you think?
Well, we've just gone through like two major subject changes here. Like the whole situation in Greece obviously is a big deal, but then also what you're getting back into here with the the climate change denial industry is also a big thing too, and I guess that's probably where my head is more at now. Although if you'd asked me yesterday, I'd have been all over the Greek.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I understand. So I'm the same way. So, but
briefly, I would just say on the subject of Greece, I lived there for a bit. I spent a year there as a student back in the 90s, and in Thessaloniki, or as you might. Some people know it more commonly as Salonika, but I would just say briefly, I don't think this deal that they've cut with Germany and the bankers in the EU is going to fly. I mean, when I went there, the whole country was on strike for one reason or another, and that's basically how it was the whole time I was there. Those people don't put up for anything, and I realized they've been under a lot of financial pain and all kinds of stuff. Basically, since I was there 20 years ago, and I realized that the screws have tightened even worse, and they're really suffering these days. But those are hard people; they're very stubborn people, and I don't think they're just going to let this slip by, and allow this austerity thing to go by without putting up a big fight. But we'll see. I mean, that's
Well, it's interesting because the government was speaking for this point of view for a long time through this, but now I noticed a piece this morning on the Prime Minister basically arguing that he's moved from leading the opposition to now he's moved to a more centrist position of trying to convince the opposition that we better kind of come all together here and find a way to deal with this because we don't really have much choice.
I think they're under a lot of threats for. I mean, he probably is in a position to see how bad things can get, and I don't know. There are people that question, what his motives are, even from the beginning, and was he secretly like a centrist or a rightist all along? And I don't know. My instinct is that he's kind of acting from a space of being genuinely scared. Rather than, being deceptive.
I understand. Yeah, I understand.
But I don't know.
Well, he came there. No, I was just going to say I can understand that. I just
enough to make a real decision like that. That's just that's a very shallow, impression on my part. But anyway.
I know it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't. And again, there's no way in the world that I can substitute, no matter what you read, for having lived there for a year and actually getting to know those people and interact with them. And because to me, it's a part of the world that I've never been to. It reads to me like a novel, in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I'm just fascinated by some of the issues surrounding this and how interwoven all of this is with international politics and commerce and economic development and everything. I mean, it's just amazing. I think it kind of gives you an idea. The one thing that I haven't mentioned through all of this is the logic of some sort of world government or world governance organization of some sort. Maybe not the United Nations. It's become so controversial to so many different people that maybe it won't work anymore. Maybe we need something with a new name or something. But it's obvious that if we're going to get some control over this, there's going to have to be some sort of international management apparatus to handle it. But on the other hand, that's what's driving the conservatives crazy, because when that happens, then their ability to gain control of the political situation from the bottom, so to speak, will be gone.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, I think the bottom's slipping out no matter what. I mean, and the idea of an overarching global control apparatus, I think, in a lot of ways, that structure has been, taking place around us, unseen for decades at least. I guess I'm not really sure, but. It is not necessarily governmental, and in fact, I think it's something quite different. In short, I would say it's what you're talking about, the big bankers, it's corporate capitalism, but like on a global scale. And I think that's exactly. Really. I think the situation in Greece. Okay, Germany kind of gets stuck with the they're wearing the black hat, so to speak. But
right.
Goldman Sachs is right there with them.
Yeah, they're getting all the blame. Goldman Sachs is flying under the radar here.
Barely.
Yeah.
They may be the shark's fin under, and who knows what else is down there. I mean, I really don't know. I don't understand how world finance and banking operates at any kind of level whatsoever. So,
But I worry about.
You spent like several weeks, immersed in articles, and you print things out and you highlight them and you research all this stuff. I haven't done any of that, so
Yeah. Well, I mean, but still,
what I have is just a loose collection of impressions. But
yeah, I understand. But I guess what really gets me is the more we're beginning to see this mysterious international creditor group that's really calling the shots here, the more you begin to see the need for some sort of international political group to control them. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah,
I can see
the need for that, but I also see like the vacuum of it. What we're looking at is something that traditional governmental structures are completely unprepared to deal with. It's like it's like since the history of from the dawn of the science of astrophysics and astronomy, we've been looking at the solar systems and planets and stars and nebula and all the kind of and then suddenly someone comes up with an idea like, wait a minute, about 80 or 90% of the observable, or not observable, but of the operative forces in the universe is actually dark matter, stuff that we can't see, and that to me is kind of like what this whole global capitalist force is. And I don't mean to present that in Marxist terms or anything like that, but I mean, but there's a massive substrata that just shapes everything. Yeah. And what we look at in terms of this is Germany, and this is the United Kingdom, and this is Spain, and this is the United States, they are kind of becoming secondary players. Like I was saying, one of the last times I called in, I was thinking, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for instance, is kind of like one of those, whether it goes through or not, it probably will, but it's not going away. If they don't pass it this time, it's going to be right back here in a few years, and they will keep doing it until they get it, because there's an organizing force there at work that the base population apparently cannot unify. I mean, the power is there, but the organization of the structure is not, and if anything, it looks like we're getting further away from the ability to organize in that kind of fashion.
Right. Well, I mean, the debate in this country between the federal government's ability to regulate industry, to regulate corporate behavior. I mean, we're looking at international corporate behavior with nobody even trying to regulate them. It's just, which means that if nobody regulates them, that means that they make the rules. They make all the decisions. And the so-called interest of the people, so to speak, the public interest of the majorities of people in these various countries that make up the developed world are left powerless. I mean, nobody's speaking for them. So in theory, if you had some sort of an organization or a representative that would at least claim to speak for the interests of the people being affected by these decisions, but on the other hand, there'd be no way for the people to hold an organization like that any more accountable than we can hold the corporations accountable.
Yeah.
So
accountability is right.
It's a tough one.
It's as though we could look at the struggle between what we see on the surface as Germany versus Greece and the debt, and all those things are kind of like a battle that's taking place on a field. The entire field is actually that terrain is set by the actual financial institutional structure there. And we tend to disregard that. We focus on the key players, but the entire thing is already it's set up, managed, and it's all determined by the flow of financial power, which is not held by the countries themselves so much. I mean, Germany is quite wealthy, but it's not the same thing.
No,
that's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah,
and it's an interesting dovetail between that and also the subject of how what you're talking about today, the orchestrated effort at climate change denial, for instance.
Right.
This is spearheaded by what was it, ExxonMobil?
Yeah, that's one. Yeah.
I saw like a document dump that I think involved them specifically, but I'm sure they're not alone. They must have partners. I mean,
it's part of this biggest. But it's interesting because we're
talking about the most profitable and the most powerful institutions of any sort in the history of humanity, essentially.
Yeah.
And they are not even a country.
No.
Exactly.
No, exactly.
I mean, they have that kind of power. They have that kind of influence, but they are not tied to geography, which makes them, in a sense, like omnipresent and omnipotent, and they can reach out and do anything anywhere, and they are doing that. And
it's kind of like virtual power.
Well, yeah, it's virtual until it strikes down. It can do real damage. That's quite material.
You're exactly right. And the point is that it seems to me, and this is one of the directions that I hope to go in, and I think I'll be able to do a little bit of it next week. But the attitude of trying to confuse the general public, so that the general public is finally just willing to throw up its hands and say, hell, there's no way we can know this stuff. I mean, it could be this, it could be that, who knows? And so basically what that, what that means is that a campaign to do that doesn't really say an awful lot about any level of respect for the ability of average people to really understand what's going on. In other words, these people are operating, these organizations are operating on the assumption that if we present it right, these people will believe anything. If we say it often enough and loud enough, they'll believe it. And when they take a survey, and 1,100 people that they survey are basically telling them in so many words that we think we believe this, but it's really kind of soft because we don't know. And these organizations and companies see this as an opportunity, and say, well, hell, if they don't know, we can convince them of anything.
Well, these assumptions have driven, American life for most.
Oh yeah,
like our entire reality since most of my life, at least. I mean, this is what drives advertising. Say it loud enough, say it enough, repeat exactly the same phrases, that will stick. This is when I became politically aware. Probably was actually a little bit later than most people that do this. I was already kind of out of university by a good ways. I mean, I followed the Clinton versus the original Bush election back in 92 or whatever, but I didn't really get hooked on politics as such until Gore versus Bush back in 2000, and when during the recount situation, I was just watching coverage here and there at work, in the bar, wherever I happened to find myself at, and I just happened to notice that everybody I was seeing patterns that were so overt. I just thought, my goodness, I just heard the same 3-word phrase, the 4-word phrase, or whatever on this one news channel, passed over on this other one, and it was like this. There's this deliberate narrative that's been constructed and is just being pushed out across the media, and it is working.
Yes,
it's working. It's working so well. It's just creepy. And at that point, I was hooked. I'm not very good at following policy and the details of getting down into the weeds and stuff, just because I don't have the time to really get myself educated to my level of satisfaction on any particular subject. But I follow messages and I follow narratives, and this is and that is what like with the global climate change or any number of things, the way they are able to push a narrative through is it's astonishing, and it's sickening, like how effective it is.
Yeah.
And you're left wondering. It's like, well, you know what? We're down to the argument of speech is money, and if you have the money to buy speech, you can just drown people in your talking points until it just sticks. And it's not even brainwashing. It's something. No. It's like brain drowning. I don't even know exactly what the term for that is.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter. It's not so much a question of not having an esteem for the average voter or the average citizen to be able to distinguish the truth from falsehood, from reality, from whatever. It's just the fact that they're only really effectively presented with like 98% of one viewpoint, and if the other 2% just happens to accidentally seep in some way, it's not going to have that much of effect. And and there is science behind this. This is tested. This is tried and true. And we're back to Citizens United. I say it's Buckley v. Vallejo back in 1976. To me, that's exactly where this started.
That's right. It is. And I'm fascinated by this when I look back at the political system as well, because when Madison and Jefferson and these terms throw around terms like educated citizenry and all of that, and knowledge is power and all this, then ultimately it's the question that keeps coming back to me is, what kind of knowledge is that? What kind of power are they talking about? And what kind of knowledge will produce it? Will produce that kind of power. And what does this, I mean, you can't ignore what Jefferson said about the way we educate the masses. All we have to do with them is basically make sure that they know what it is we want them to believe and do. And and what does that say about our republic and about our whole education system and everything else? I mean, that all of this, it seems to me, comes home to roost there, because that's what when you talk about advertising is based on the fact that the average person doesn't really know what to believe or how to distinguish one piece of information from another. The one they hear the most, or that seems to make the most sense or strike a chord, that's the one they go with.
Well, I would think that modern advertising is mostly what slips under the radar when people are preoccupied with something else. The thing we have to remember, it's worth remembering anytime we get a chance. When Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton, those people were talking, they were dealing in a non-information age. I mean, there is no such thing as advertising, essentially.
Right.
You didn't have that. You were not, okay, I moved to Taiwan, I guess, it's going to be just about 14 years ago. And one of the first things I noticed, it took a couple of months to catch up with me, but one thing I noticed is transplanting myself into an environment where I had no clue about the language. I mean, I tried to listen to tapes and stuff, didn't work. I couldn't read it because the characters, it doesn't even have an alphabet. You can't even sound things out. It's just, it's the most foreign place in the world, except maybe to the Arabic countries, that an American can go to. And I realized after a couple of months here that I had a lot more internal quiet, because whatever advertising barrages were happening around me were just not penetrating. They couldn't get to me because I couldn't comprehend it. I couldn't conceive of it. Right. I could walk down the street and there would be signs, there would be flashing billboards, there would be this. If there's a TV on in a restaurant that I'm sitting in or passing by, none of it could touch me. And it was, once I appreciated that, wow. It was. Oh yeah. It was like decompressing. I felt like I'd come up from being submerged at 200 meters below the sea level. And I was just a bunch of stuff was just bubbling off of me because they did. And that is a constant barrage that you undergo. Whatever society you live in, as long as you're an insider. And but Jefferson didn't have to deal with that. He had access to information, but that the average citizen couldn't, and in fact would never even have a prayer of getting access to. Like even textbooks, just the idea. I mean, his school model is that we're going to send kids to school for 3 years, and they're going to learn to read and write basically, and they're going to study history in 3 years. Well, I don't know the specifics of the system, but I doubt seriously that they were going to be presented with their own textbooks to take home and read.
No, you're exactly right.
Because books were like gold. I mean, in a very real sense. I mean, like maybe not quite that expensive, but expensive enough that it was priced out of the reach of the average person. So we're not talking about. I mean, now and for my entire life, and I think for yours too probably. Although through different media, information is more or less ubiquitous. It's just the media itself has changed somewhat. But you've always had access to it. I've always had access to it. But when they were there, trying to shape their ideal of how things were going to work, it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I've got to tell you that, I mean, the point that you just made, it's blowing me away. I've got to do something about it later because I've got to return to this. And the reason I say this is because I've always had a feeling, although I've never been comfortable saying it this way, but when you look at Jefferson's 3 years of mandatory education for the masses, what he's talking about is enough information for us to tell you what we want you to know and believe, but not enough information for you to do anything about it except accept it. And when you said that when you first went to Taiwan, they couldn't penetrate you with that kind of advertising, that kind of information, because you didn't understand anything about the language. They couldn't reach you. So in a sense, you were in a better position that you've ever been since, really, because they couldn't influence you. But once you became more familiar with the culture and the language, I'm guessing that you became more able to deal with the advertising and with that kind of information, and you opened yourself up to being influenced by them, by the signs, by the newspapers, by the media, etc. And I think that's fascinating because that's a classic example which seems to prove what Jefferson's 3-year plan would do. It would create the ability to read and write, which would be just enough for us to be able to communicate with you the things we want you to know and believe, but not enough information or knowledge for you to do anything else. And that was sufficient. Holy God, that's unbelievable. If you think about it, that's amazing. Because you've lived it. I mean, you're living proof of exactly what what I've been kind of for a long time hesitant to say, but that's really the way I looked at it. I mean, what can you do in terms of holding people accountable and judging people and being able to recognize posturing and all of that stuff? With 3 years of elementary education? No way. The only thing that you could do is teach people to say, this person has position, this person has a degree, or this person has a job, and therefore you need to listen to what this person says about this, and this. And that's our education system. Holy God, that's amazing. Wow. What an education I got! What an education I got today in the last 10 minutes. It's just great. Great.
Well, with one caveat, I would just have to say that I really haven't made that many inroads with the language. I mean, I still don't pay attention to television. I still don't pay attention to advertisement.
I understand. I'm sure.
I actually suspect that one of the reasons why I have a problem with the language comprehension here that I have, even after all this time, and I've studied intensively for the better part of the last 10 years, and I'm still not good at it. I think I've got a subconscious block I kind of prefer not really knowing what this particular soap opera is about or what this thing is, because it really is just banal and stupid and
I understand.
And, it's even much less sophisticated than it is in America, and American advertising is insulting enough, so
exactly. But going back to the idea of the ugly American, and even when you can communicate with another culture, you don't communicate on a level which understands the nuances of things like bowing and those kinds of things, and what they mean, and the way that you can insult other cultures. I mean, even when you learn the language, you don't learn those things.
Oh well, I have to give them credit here, and I think this is. I don't know about Chinese culture at large. I've been to the mainland a few times, but in Taiwan at least, they cut you an enormous amount of slack if you're a foreigner and you're in any situation where you give any kind of anything that could be even ambiguously translated to someone insulting. They're going to go out of their way to not see it that way.
Yeah.
In fact, they have a whole culture of like what they will acknowledge has just happened and what they won't, and so. You're given a lot of slack here. It does not work both ways, though. If a Chinese tourist comes to America, watch out. If you're in the wrong place, just you could be in trouble. So
what an education you're giving folks that are tuned into us, because you're experiencing things that many of us have never had the chance to experience, and you're doing it on a level, and to be very honest with you, you're bright enough to realize and understand what you're experiencing. Most people don't know that. I mean, to most people, it's just things I don't understand. But, you know, you're able to break it down and figure it out and say, this is something I'm just as well off not understanding, you know, and this kind of stuff. That's great. That is just wonderful.
Well, I've had a lot of time in a sort of virtual isolation to sit and pace back and forth and think about these things. So it's...
Yeah.
You become... I mean, I've always been kind of reflective anyway, but like when in a cultural transplant situation like that, I mean... You have to. There's really no other choice. So
I'm going to, if you don't have any objection to it, I'm going to sit down, if not today, later today, tomorrow, on the virtual center page on Facebook, and just put together a paragraph about this conversation, because I really think this is important to document. I want to keep this one. I mean, I want it to be there where everybody can see it, because I think it's important. I mean, this whole idea that, you know, that the minimal kind... I put a document on Facebook, you know, maybe 3, 4, 5 days ago about Jefferson and Jefferson's plan. And then I wrote about it, and a couple of days later I wrote a piece about it. But I didn't include this. And it seems to me that when you start to when you start to look seriously at, you know, in 3 years, what can you know, how independent action-wise can you become after 3 years of elementary education and nothing more? I mean, how independent, how in control of your own life can you possibly be?
I don't even understand
the implication,
how you're supposed to be able to learn to competently read after 3 years. I mean,
no, exactly. I mean, you know,
depth.
Exactly.
I mean, you can get the ABC part, but after that.
So what you're doing is you're giving people the kind of information you want, enough information so that you can communicate to them exactly what you want them to know and what you want them to believe and how you want them to act, and the signals you want them to look for, the characteristics or the virtues that you want them to support, and the things you want them to be aware of or be careful about, and all of that. And so what you're doing is you're educating them enough to be responsible to signs and signals, and calling it education.
I don't know. I need to read Jefferson's entire plan, but I'm not sure I'm convinced that it's all as sinister as that.
Oh no! I'm extreme. I'm making it sound more extreme than it is.
I really believe. Consider that he was you know, positing a population that was like 80 to 90% agrarian, where everyone was going to be a farmer with you know, their own land to till and subside off.
That's right, and it was a very noble thing to be doing. Exactly.
And it seems that he seems sincere when he says that, you know, we'll teach history because that will teach, you know, this has happened before. The people will have enough education to recognize when they see like a similar pattern emerging. I don't know. I mean, we both know what a complex, you know, character Jefferson was. So that does on the outside seem a little bit naive that he would think that would be enough. But at the same time, it may have been a compromised position. Who knows? Right. I don't even know how old a student was meant to be when they entered his educational system.
No, that's true. You know, that's true.
I went to school when I was 5 years old. He may not have been.
No, it's not that. My guess is it's probably 10, 12 years old, something like that. But
possibly.
But I also think, in Jefferson's defense, that he really, he was kind of in the forefront of the idea that he really believed that you know, if you asked people to do more than they were capable of, you were just stressing them out. You were unfairly taxing them. His idea was, this is a way to teach people what they need to know, and that's it. But everybody has a right. Everybody should know it.
Okay, you know? Well, Dr. Bill, I could tell you, like, from one teacher to another, because I spent 10 years teaching here. Yeah, I bet you that your experience and mine, you know, you've taught vastly, you know, a completely different, you know, student population than I have. But I bet you and I would both agree that if anything, the opposite holds. It's when you start teaching above your students, what you even expect your students can do. When you put that pressure on, they will exceed. Yeah, they may not meet the standard that you're teaching to, but they will go so far higher than they would have. Right. Because they are just uniquely, you know, they have so many resources, you know, but you have to put a little pressure there. I mean, it doesn't have to be traumatic. It doesn't have to be traumatic. We're not talking about high stakes testing like happens in the school system. But
I used to say to classes all the time, if it's not a little bit over your head, how can you learn? It has to be. It has to be something you have to reach for if it's going to be worth reaching. You know, if it's something that just reinforces what you already believe, then there's no thinking going on at all. You know,
you're entering an equilibrium system and introducing turbulence, and it has to be uncomfortable enough that they have to actually, strive to organize and get themselves to a higher level, and it works every time. And I don't care what the level the student is, you will always find that if you ask them to do something a little bit more than they can do, they will. If they don't quite meet your expectation or the standard that you set, they will still get higher than they would have if you hadn't asked. And that's right. To me, that's the core of education. And Dr. Bill, I've run out the show here. I'm sorry.
I think we're out of time. I didn't want to say that. I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. But anyway, thank you, Horst, so much. Thank you. Have a great weekend, and I appreciate this. And I'll write something up on Facebook if I can.
Well, you too. I'm thrilled to be a part of it. And
thank you very much. I appreciate you very much. We've reached the end of our program today, the end of this week's program. It's almost the top of the hour. I want to thank you all for listening. I want you to be safe. Take care of yourself. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And remember us when we run again the 1st of next week. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. Be safe.